One of my favorite things I discovered is I found several Bibles that have two copies of Laodiceans. Like they'll have one after Colossians and then one between Philemon and Hebrews, where clearly like there has been an effort here to reintroduce a text to a Bible that a reader or reader turned scribe thought was missing it.
Ian, it's so great to see you again. Glad to have you back on to talk actually about something that we almost talked about last time, a potentially lost letter of Paul, something that might find some listeners catch them by surprise. Other people are like, oh, I'm so glad because I have been waiting to hear Ian talk about this because maybe they've read your article. So thanks for taking the time to come by and talk about this today.
Absolute pleasure. Love to be back.
And I'm very glad that you're talking about this, and you're going to be talking about this more at the New Insights into the New Testament conference in September. So there's a link down below, but fair warning for all of you, this is not a total spoiler. This is going to come up, but we'll bridge into more. So if you're interested, if you love that kind of stuff, check out the link down below. But can we start at the very beginning of this? Because astute Bible readers are probably familiar with the idea that in Colossians, we get these references to Laodicea, and even the idea of this letter. So we don't have that thing. Is this a lost letter? Is this all make-believe? Ian, where do you start this conversation when you're introducing someone to it for the first time?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we know Paul refers to in several places to letters we don't have. In 1 Corinthians, he refers to letters. There are a couple other passages that people point to. And one of the places everyone goes to is Colossians 4:16, where Paul says, he tells the Christians in Colossae, in the city of Colossae, to have the letter he's currently writing also circulated in Laodicea, which is just 10 miles away. And read also, or see to it that, the verb is, yeah, anyways, see to it that you read also the letter from Laodicea. And the Greek is a little ambiguous, but the text seems to suggest, and the parallelism definitely suggests, and the history of interpretation strongly suggests, that Paul had written also a letter to the church in Laodicea that he wishes to have circulated and read also in the city of Colossae. And we don't have any such letter, it seems. There is no such letter under that heading. And so Christians have for a very long time supposed that there is a letter missing. There have been different answers over the history of the tradition. Some people have identified 1 Timothy as that letter. Some people have identified Hebrews as a letter. But for centuries, and this is what my primary talk is on, and I think we're going to retreat back to the early church here for a second, but for centuries, in fact, for over a millennium, Christians didn't see any problem because they had a letter by that title in their Bible, a Pauline epistle to the Laodiceans that shows up in hundreds of Latin and then even more vernacular and even some early printed Bibles.
You use the phrase, it seems, when we're talking about this thing that we don't have. Can we start there? Because you said it seems, and then you throw out some references to other known things that we have. So when you're saying that this does show up in lots of Bibles that we do have, should listeners be thinking, okay, well, this is a letter by another name, or are you talking about something different altogether?
So, some spoilers here, I suppose, but that's just fine. Marcion had a letter and had a Greek letter to the Laodiceans. And when we don't have any of Marcion's Bibles, we talked about Marcion last time, this church heretic that comes to Rome in 144 and is instrumental in the formation of the canon. And when our anti-Marcionite readers quote Marcion's letter to the Laodiceans, it reads just like our Ephesians. And if you go back and look at our earliest manuscripts of Ephesians, Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, and the one papyrus we have of the relevant portion of Ephesians, it is not addressed to the Ephesians. Our earliest manuscripts have it addressed simply to the saints, not the saints in Ephesus. They're lacking all of the address to the Ephesians. And there is evidence that the earliest form of the non-Marcionite Latin Bible, as attested by these, it's complicated, but these early prologues, basically, seems to have had Laodiceans in the place of Ephesians, coming before Colossians and under the title of Laodiceans. So scholars have long concluded, and I think they're probably right, that the actual letter to the Laodiceans, the one that Paul or the author of Colossians is referring to as Laodiceans, is in fact the text we know today as Ephesians. A bunch of complicated arguments to sort of wrinkle out the extra details, but that's the basic case. Of course, Christians didn't know that, and this is how,
Mhm.
if you go read my open access letter on the Epistle to Laodiceans, you'll find I acknowledge this basically in the first two paragraphs and point out that this is a conclusion of like 19th century biblical scholars, and is unknown to most early church fathers. There are a couple exceptions to that, but is unknown to basically everyone for the history of Christianity. And so, from somewhere to fill that gap comes the Pauline epistle to the Laodiceans that I work on the manuscripts, collections, and reception history of.
We'll have a link to that article down below. I definitely recommend going to read it if you're interested in this. The gap that gets filled here is
Yeah,
fascinating because
yeah.
as it's bringing up this problem brings up so many different things of misidentified text, and then also a name that everybody loves to hate, Marcion, where Marcion was maybe right, but because is Marcion, like now it ends up being wrong. When
Yes.
we have a thing emerging, what do we know about the context for the thing that comes
Mhm.
out that becomes this letter?
Yeah, so Bart Ehrman's theory on this, he published a essay and then a chapter on this years ago now, is that actually the letter is forged in order to displace or in order to answer claims that Marcionite Christians have a letter that the Orthodox are missing. That is, you run into a Marcionite in the street or stumble into a Marcionite church, which apparently was actually a problem in antiquity. We have some references to people accidentally going to Marcionite churches and thinking they were Orthodox. Um, and they say, look, we have the letter that Paul refers to in Colossians, and you, non, you other kinds of Christians, are missing this. So clearly, we're the better church. We're the older church. And Ehrman's theory is that Laodiceans was actually forged or supplied or composed, or perhaps even you can even suppose it wasn't forged for this purpose, but it was forged for whatever reason, maybe a sort of fictional exercise, but then was received and incorporated into canons and collections because it scratched the itch, right? Because it provide no, we do have this letter. It's in our Bibles or it's in our collections or we have manuscripts of the real Laodiceans, and it's not your Marcionite text or your Marcionite text of Ephesians. We have this letter, but we exclude it for one of many reasons, or maybe we keep it. Lots of early Christians kept this text as an authoritative, canonical letter of Paul. And so this is Ehrman's theory. There's of course an inverted reading of this, which is a succession of scholars have actually argued that it's a Marcionite forgery, this Laodiceans, because of basically the same problem run in reverse of later Marcionites knowing that Marcion had a text of Laodiceans and but their copies of the Bible had Ephesians in Greek, called Ephesians, and so they were supplying their teacher's text. So one way or another, lots of people have supposed that this has something to do with Marcion, and that goes back to an ambiguous reference that associates the forgery of Laodiceans with Marcion in the earliest reference, which is the Muratorian fragment, which says that two letters have been forged in the name of Paul. Ad herese Marcionis, which means something like for the or against the heresy of Marcion,
When
which is the problem.
this is stuff that is so much fun. The drama and the infighting that happens behind texts is so much more complicated than just, hey, open it up and the things that in front of you are the things that they had. All of this back and forth and fighting makes it
Yeah.
much more fascinating. When you look at the letter that comes to be the thing that gets
Yes.
identified as this, not Marcion's version, but the other, which might also
Yes.
be Marcion's version, maybe. But
Uh,
in that one, does it do a good job of sounding like Paul? Does it pass muster for enough people, or is it kind of one of those like, well, it's close enough, but we know it's not Marcion's, so we like it and it gives us a thing?
yeah.
Like how does it pass the smell test?
It sounds just like Paul. In fact, for some, like Thomas Aquinas, it sounds too much like Paul. Thomas Aquinas says
Ah,
it's Paul's letter, but it's redundant with the canonical epistles, so it didn't need to be in the canon.
what a
So which is
solution.
a Yeah, quite the interesting argument. And for a lot of sort of modern scholars, 19th, 20th century scholars, 21st century scholars, even, uh, the the letter has been described as a canto, which is a collection of excerpts, or a crib, or a plagiarism, or a harmony, even like kind of like Tatian's Diatessaron of the
Mhm.
Pauline letters. That is, someone has taken different bits of Pauline phrases and pieced them together into a new letter. I think that's actually an overstatement. I think the letter is doing more interesting work than that gives it credit for. But if you open the letter up and start reading, you'll find that the very first verse is basically Galatians 1. And then you'll find that the whole thing is structured on Philippians. And you'll find there are phrases like to live as Christ and to die as joy, that kind of stuff, that are like almost exactly, but slightly off from what Paul had. So it is certainly an imitation of Pauline style, Pauline structure, Pauline phraseology. It's short. It's actually closer to like what most real letters look like from antiquity. It's about the same length as Philemon,
Mhm.
but it's certainly Pauline. I mean, and for centuries, Christians thought it was written by Paul, and then had to debate whether or not on that basis it was authoritative, it was canonical. And
It kinda sounds like, as you're describing the way it pulls on existing Pauline materials or style, is it
yeah.
like if you asked an AI model to go and write a thing based off of a like, does it kind of feel like that version of we're drawing on these texts, and in order to sound like it, we're not being creative, we're just impersonating?
Yeah, that's a interesting analogy, and someone's got to write that article. Someone should write an article about um, uh, large language models and kentos, or what's the other word people use? Pastiches of ancient texts in antiquity.
'Cause it's the
I
best way to sound like the
Yeah,
person is to just quote the person,
that's
unless
right.
you end up sounding too much like them and you get cut out, which is such a fun reason to cut them out. It's just redundant. I don't need it.
The whole the whole subject depresses me too much to write on right now. But it's an interesting prompt, and some other scholar could tackle that.
Well, I wanna aim you then at something that's hopefully less depressing that you talk about in your article is some of what's happening in the margins for the copies that we do have, because
Yeah,
you went through manuscript after manuscript, looking at where these things show up, what we're getting on the sides, the commentary that happens in this, and what I loved about that, and I'd love to have you talk about more, is what that tells us about what the readers think about
yeah.
and believe, and where maybe belief might be the wrong question in this. So when you're doing this study, what does this marginalia tell you about that process of reception?
Yeah, thank you. So this is the article published in the Journal of Bible and Its Reception, titled "Canonizing Paul's Epistle to Laodiceans." And the previous largest catalog of manuscripts of Laodiceans was in this old 19th century, late 19th century collection of Vulgate manuscripts, and it said that we have about 70 manuscripts of Laodiceans. And this has been quoted by everyone. Bruce Metzger, all the canon and manuscript people say, we have probably about 100 manuscripts. I found about 305 searching over the last couple years, and that included going to libraries and just flipping through all of their Latin Bibles. Certainly, there are more because there are lots of medieval Bibles that just nobody bothers indexing all of because they're all too similar, is the sort of language you'll find in old catalogers. So I found over 300 Latin Bibles, just just Latin, just the language of Latin. There's tons of others in other languages that contain Laodiceans. And I decided for this article, I wanted to look at marginalia, like you said, and then other paratexts. So, like
Mhm.
titles, chapter headings, introductions, where the text is collected in the Bible. Is it after Colossians? Is it after Philemon? Is it after Hebrews? Is it at back of the Bible? Is it next to Acts for some reason, which happens? Um, uh, which is kind of like a paratext, the sort of choices that readers and producers of manuscripts are making, and is also influencing subsequent readers. And found all kinds of different and conflicting, sometimes in one manuscript, evidence. So I found liturgical marks, so evidence that this text is being read probably in monasteries as part of continuous readings of Scripture. I found headings that give it different titles, like Paul's second epistle to the Colossians, which I found just flipping through one Latin Bible in the library in Philadelphia, which is not in any catalog, and no one's ever noticed this before. Um, I found introductions that explain how this letter fit into the life of Paul. I also found copies where this was crossed out, where this seems to have been torn out of Bibles, where people wrote, "Do not read this." Probably it looks like a hand of that was otherwise producing sort of lectionary notes for another monastic context that wrote, "Don't read this." I've found people write "wakat," which is like "leave this empty." in the across it. And also, I found people copying different church fathers' comments on Laodiceans, either as prefaces or on the margins. So the two conflicting ones here is Jerome saying this text is a forgery that is rejected by all, which some people copy into the margins of Laodiceans, and Gregory, who says this text is Paul's. Paul wrote it. Paul wrote 15 epistles, but only 14 of them are canonical. So saying this is a real letter of Paul, which is not part of canonical scripture. And so you get both sides. And then some people, I mean, also interesting, copying Colossians 4:16, where Paul says, "Read this letter," into as a preface or as a marginal note. Or inversely, I found several Bibles that copy Laodiceans into the margins of Colossians 4:16. In fact, I found some subsequent to writing this article. So every possible way of responding to this you can imagine, there are examples of in Bibles used by people for centuries.
When you're looking at that diversity of interaction with this, because it's I don't know another word to use other than interaction for something so broad.
Yeah.
Is this on par with the type of response you see for other, maybe more stable
Mm.
texts? Is it getting this same kind of treatment, or does this have a flourishing that shows you there is something bubbling here and there are debates that are happening, and so there's more wrestling and more footnotes and
Yeah.
more commentary going back and forth?
You can find both. You can find Bibles where there has been a concerted effort to make this look just like the other Pauline epistles. People composing illustrations of Paul writing Laodiceans in the manuscripts, producing these paratexts like chapter lists and introductions to make it just fit exactly like the other letters. You can find letter copies where it's left bare, so it's left without the
Mm.
normal paratexts, which sort of distinguishes it from the other letters. But like to your point, like one of my favorite things I discovered is I found several Bibles that have two copies of Laodiceans. Like they'll have one after Colossians and then one between Philemon and Hebrews, where clearly like there has been an effort here to reintroduce a text to a Bible that a reader or a reader turned scribe thought was missing it, but actually
Mhm.
had just missed the fact that probably it showed up later. So it wasn't after
You looked in the
Colossians
wrong
where the reader
spot.
thought it should exactly. And so uh, you know, twice as biblical as any other Pauline epistle in these cases. Um, so that does suggest an active interest in this text. Likewise, someone's copying the entire letter into the margins or the foot along the bottom of Colossians is a great effort to go to
Mhm.
resupply this text.
When you're looking at these responses, something we have talked about and many scholars do is the responses about authenticity and
Yeah.
and authority in trying to
Yep.
decide what is valuable or how they go about creating something that might
Hmm.
seem to be valuable. And here we get both of these things, but at the same time, you've also talked about how this kind of sets for itself also a third path.
Yeah.
So, can you say more about that and how that should challenge how we're thinking about how people thought about what counts as scripture, what counts as canon, what counts as authority? Because it that term can get just brought out and people are like, yep, okay, now we can move on.
Yeah.
But as you're going through all of this, it's very clear it is far from a simple or easy to define process.
Yeah, so this is tricky because I have to sort of walk a middle path here or negotiate between two things. Um, there is a tendency, there has been a recent, in the last 20 years, move in scholarship to try to actually divorce, um, in our descriptions of historical actors, divorce our notion of authenticity from their notion of from their notion of authority, or maybe even divorce authenticity as a value judgment from orthonymity that is proper. It is written
Mhm.
by the person who claims it to be written. Um, and I am not engaged in the sort of contemporary theological arguments, so I'm not really interested in what you read in church. I mean, I read what I read in church, and you can read what you want to read in church. That's fine. Um, so I'm not making that kind of argument, but I the evidence that I'm presenting, I think, could be read as supporting this argument with respect to someone like actually Origen is an interesting case study. Something, arguing that ancients did not share our conception of orthonymity, did not share concern over the text actually being written by the person to whom it's attributed to. And my teacher is Bart Ehrman, one of my teachers, and I'm actually very resistant to that trend in recent scholarship. Um, I think it's actually wrong. I think the vast majority of the evidence we have, specifically for Greek and Roman readers, but likewise, I think you can find similar things in Syriac or Aramaic or Second Temple Jewish sources. The overwhelming majority of the evidence suggests a close identification between authority, between authenticity as a value judgment, and orthonymity. So
Mhm.
I do think, you see this also in most of the early reception of Laodiceans, like the Muratorian fragment. It's a forgery, therefore don't read it. Philastratus of Brescia. This text is what may have been written by Paul, but it's been interpolated by heretics, so don't read it. Jerome of Stridon. It's a forgery, don't read it. So you see, I do think that ancient readers, for the most part, did not divorce those things the way scholars have sort of been pushing for. And like, it's a whole interesting conversation. We can talk about sort of intentionally fictive exercises, and like people wrote fiction in antiquity too. There are conversations to be had there. But I conclude my essay by saying, like, I actually don't think this supports this contemporary trend in scholarship. That said, what I think this letter shows is that despite early conversations conflating authority with authorship, that um and that over time the idea of a canon developed as a tertium quid, that is, a list of authoritative works that became a independent source for authority, that then allowed for more nuanced conversations around authorship and authenticity. And so
Mhm.
you could say things, and you can find both sides of this coin, but you can say things like, this letter was written by Paul, but is not authoritative because it's not in the canon. So the canon develops as this sort of imagined third source of authority, that authority no longer rests in the person, no longer rests in the experiences or inspiration or divine status of the individual, which is the kind of rhetoric we find um, in either sort of Hellenistic, Second Temple, early Roman, early Christian sources, which is, the writings of Moses are authoritative because of the kind of experiences Moses had, because of the kinds of experience that Orpheus had, because of the kind of ascent that Paul had, right? But you sort of have a divorce of the biography of the individual, of orthonymity, from authority. And so now authority rests in this canon, which is this sort of mystical other third thing. Mystical is, I'm sort of hand waving, but like exactly where canonicity comes from is sort of left ambiguous. Sometimes it's what the fathers have handed down to us. There's different rhetoric you find around the canon, but it becomes this third thing which independently gives authority to a text. And this allows for the position of Gregory, for the position of Priscillian of Avila, for the position of subsequent church authorities who can say something like, Paul wrote this, even Thomas Aquinas, Paul wrote this, but it's not authority. It's not in the canon. It's not scripture. And you can sort of see why I'm wrestling with this, because if the very divorce that's become popular in contemporary scholarship is actually a great description of what's happening in Gregory's time. It's not a great description of what's going on in the second and third century for the most part.
So for you, as you're looking back over the manuscript copies that you found, the interactions with this, do you feel like you've recovered more of a glimpse into this debate around authority in canon than really something about a manuscript or a lost letter itself?
Yeah, so no, I mean, this is really the focus of my work. I am putting together a new critical edition of this text, but I'm less interested in the origins debate than I am in uh, the history of the canon debate,
Mhm.
or in scholarship in the history of the canon. And the innovation intervention term I'm sort of trying to push with that article and other work is a move away from just talking about canon in terms of formation. Canon, you know, is almost, I bet I should do an engram search, but it feels like canon, with respect to New Testament and biblical scholarship, it's always about formation of the canon. As if once you reach Constantine, as if once you reach Athanasius, or some particular point, pick your point, and it's formed, then it's over, and it's settled. And I'm pushing rather canon maintenance, drawing on Peter Berger's account of like world maintenance. That is, that canons don't actually exist the way people talk about them, as a thing just out there in the world, that are sort of self-sustaining or exert agency on human beings, but are rather conventions that require societies, people, individuals to continue to do work to keep them stable, to keep them relevant, to keep them active, to police their boundaries. And I think one of the things I'm trying to illustrate with Laodiceans is Laodiceans shows how the canon had to be maintained across time, in all the different ways that I've mentioned.
And that's for your talk at the New Insights into the New Testament conference. Is that the jump you're going from this letter into these broader conversations of canon? Because there it's focused on Apocrypha and canon this year, right?
Yep. Yeah, so I'm really going to be focusing on all the evidence we have, only a little bit of which I've sampled here, for the use of this text as scripture. And then, who is using this, when, why, how, what's the evidence we have that this in fact was functioning as a book of the New Testament, as a letter of Paul, and then looking at where and when and how that declines. Why does this text disappear? We have reformers using this text. We have Counter-Reformation Catholic theologians defending this text. We have this text being printed in early modern Bibles. We have American churches preaching from this text. So why does no one know about this? I mean, New Testament scholars, most of them, if they don't work in Apocrypha, have never heard of this text. If they have, they might have seen it in grad school. And then your average priest or pastor, no shade, but just like has no idea this text exists. And yet it was in so many Bibles.
Well, if you are interested in learning more about this, and I don't know why you wouldn't be, there's a link down in the description. You can go and join Ian at the New Insights into the New Testament conference in September. Go and learn about what is the long and storied history here. And I'm interested to hear if you have any updated thoughts about this being an early model AI type of thing. I don't think it is. But it is a weird way to think about what they're doing with this and how it continues to impact and create debate, because that feels like it ties in some ways. Like, oh, if it's that, is that a reason to not like it or not? I don't know. If you want to pivot your whole topic, feel free. But the link is down in the description. Go and join Ian. Ian, thanks so much for coming to talk about this. It's always a pleasure to get to pick your brain.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.